All right. Good morning, everyone. Uh, Hope you're having a good Thursday. So we're gonna try this Blackboard again, and hopefully it'll hold up through the lecture. So I've wanted to make sure that everybody knew two things. One, I copied a lecture that I gave to a different Texas class over into your section so that you could listen to that lecture over the same material that I'd given the day before or the day after, I'm not sure. But so whatever we might have missed here or there, right, because of technical issues on Tuesday, that's probably covered in as I go over the same slides in a different class. Because I know that some of y'all had as a lot of us did, have problems getting back in and having good audio and a video. And it looks like there was some problem in the recording of the video as well. I think there's some time there that's missing. So nevertheless, there's a second video there of me covering the same material that you can look back through to see what's going on. The second thing is I wanted to make sure that everybody is aware of the political compass, and that it's, I want you to start doing that. It's not due for a week and a half, so there's nothing pressing on it, but I did want you to know that it's there, and you need to go if you want extra credit, right? Go take that quiz and then support. Man, submit your results to me through Blackboard. So Davin says it shocked by the results that received there, and that might be good, right? That might be a good thing. You believe you are of one perspective because that's what you've grown up with, that's what you've known, those are the people you've been around. But when you start answering questions that are policy oriented and are questioning you not just about where are you on this issue, but how strongly do you feel about where you are on that issue, it might map you out to a place that's different than you thought you were going to be. Let me just jump over there real quick and make sure that everybody sees what I'm talking about there. I'll share this screen. There we go. So this is the political compass here that you're going to click on, right? It'll bring this up. You click this URL to go to the political compass page. Let me kick y'all over to that page. We'll stop sharing that screen. Come over here and I'll share this screen. There we go. So when you're here, right, you'll click on take the test. When you get done, you'll get a result like this. And you'll be able to click on this, right click on this chart and save it as an image file, either a JPEG or a PNG. Save it to your computer or your phone. And then once you've done that, you will come back into this area and you will click political compass, right? You will browse to the file that you just saved and you will then select it here and then hit submit, and that will upload it. And you can see the due date here, February 5th, and then 10 extra credit points, which is, something. So that's what I want you to do, right? Again, you've got till the 5th of February to submit that political compass. I will not be Not if it was, I don't care what the color of it was, as long as it was actually your results. I'll try to take a look at it and see what's going on there after class. Let me write that down. Okay. So please go do that and get yourself some extra credit points. And if any of you do want to discuss what you got, so it says, Davin says, voted for Trump but got back in lines of Hawkins. Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is that who you vote for, right, might be very different from what your policy beliefs are, because we don't have candidates that go across the political spectrum, right? So you have to choose who you're willing to vote for a lot of other reasons sometimes than just policy perspective. And that's normal in every election, right? Especially in a majoritarian system like ours, where there's two main parties, you're going to end up in the general election with probably two candidates that you're looking at. They're not going to have the same policy, right, perspective. So you're going to be making choices that are not perfectly fitting with where you are, and that's normal, and it's also a bit of a challenge. Yeah, we're gonna do the explanations there. We're gonna do libertarian and socialism, and we'll talk about what those mean a little bit. So. There's generally, if you look at that chart, if we were to chart out the average student in my class taking that, you will end up on the left libertarian side, right? So down and to the left of the center dot, that's where majority of the ones that I see end up. I love the idea of a radical centrist. So it's, it might be a little eye-opening to you. It might make you think a little bit about where you are, who you're supporting, what policies are important to you. Again, you're going to get points for doing the exercise. I don't care and will not call you out on any place that you land on that chart, right? The other thing is that you may every couple years or whatever come back and retake it, because where you place on that chart will change as you go through life and have different experiences, and your priorities change, right? So it's not at all odd to see that as you get older, you will move toward the top right, toward an authoritarianism. Right, and it's kind of normal, right? And the reason is that you stop being as accepting of change, and you want things to be kind of locked down and safe and knowledgeable. What you want to know, what you know, and you don't want things getting right wild and crazy. And so you're more reluctant to change and more accepting of the status quo. So okay, so yeah, let's we'll get, I want to hold off on that because I want to do not just libertarian and socialism. I want to do some more. So let's get into lecture and move into lecture. We will talk about what I call the isms. Okay, there are a lot of them. So and at the end of this slide deck, you're going to see 8 or 10. So let's get the slide deck up and get started. Let's see, before I do that, let's grab a screenshot real quick. So here's where we finished on Tuesday, was working through the beliefs that Texans have about themselves and about government, and how much government they want, and how big, what group they want to follow, and where power comes from, which sets us up to actually talk about the elements of the Texas Creed. There are 5 of them. These are in order of most important to least important to Texans. If we were to do this same kind of thing and look at the United States or as a whole, or look at other individual states, the position of these elements would differ. And so that's why this is right, the Texas Creed, as opposed to the California Creed or the Minnesota Creed. Or for Texas, right, we continually through polling and questionnaires and such bring up the importance of individualism. And the idea of individualism is, of course, that we'll go through each of these independently, and they'll build on each other. But these are the 5 ideas. But the idea of individualism is that you as an individual should be able, in your society, to direct your own life, to make your own decisions about who you are, what you want to do, how you want to live your life, with as little interference or structured guidance or regulation, however you want to look at it, from government as possible. And this idea that the individual should be in charge of their life and shouldn't be made to follow the group or the government or any, is very Protestant, I say, in its background, in the sense that when Martin Luther, right, broke away from the Catholic Church, the main argument that follows out of that breakaway from the Catholic Church is a radical change from relying upon the authority structure of the Catholic Church to intercede and give you access to God's thought and God's salvation, to an individualist perspective that I can do this on my own and I can be responsible for my own salvation. And so in 1600, when he nails the theses to the church door and says, we don't need the authority structure, the Pope and the bishops and all that to tell us how to do this. We can talk to God directly. That's the background that really starts driving this big idea that individuals, are responsible for themselves. Individuals don't have to always be defined and working through a group or an authority structure or something like that. Now, so that's where it kind of really bubbles up, and it's not the only place we see it, but it's the biggest break and the biggest explosion of this idea in historical thought. And by the time we're in the United States, and especially by the time we're in Texas, this is common, The whole Texas perspective is the solitary, rugged, individual, cowboy-like, out there in the world, bending the world to their perspective and desires, and making something out of themselves, And if they make it, then they were good and strong and had a great idea, and everybody should respect what they did. And if they fail, well, sometimes you fail, and you probably did something wrong, Try again, But it's all this success and this failure and these decisions are all upon the back of the individual, and that's not necessarily the norm, especially at the extent that we have it in Texas and other places, Even with the drive to emphasize individual direction and control and responsibility of one's own life, a lot of other places, you're still defining yourself and your choices within a community, family structure, social structure, a community structure, And you're a lot more intertwined with that idea, and you're part of the community success, and they're part of your success. And when you have that kind of perspective, your expectations of government and what its proper role are much different than if you're an individualist perspective like we are in Texas. So we get to the point of being able to make the argument that every individual should be able to get out there and strive and create and define their own life. They should have a realm of liberty about them that lets them be free from government constraint and regulation, and should be able to go about doing this on their own. So when that's the base idea that informs who you are and what your perspective is to government, you're going to have a much different idea of government's role and purpose than if it were something else. And that's the point of individualism. And that's why we see it as the most important, because it builds this base that the rest of this is going to be built on. The second idea that Texans tend to tell us about and tell us is very important in their lives is the idea of liberty. And the definition of liberty is, right, a area that is protected or free from government infringement, right? So when you, right, say, give me liberty or give me death, as our, one of our adages is, what you're saying is freedom, right? Give me a space outside of government. Give me a place where I can be myself. And so liberty is, when we talk about it and when we write about it, a limitation on government authority that allows the individual to grow in their own direction, to be an individual, right? And so this is a very important idea for Texans, and it's one where we have a continual debate, because we're trying to draw, right, a line here between proper government action and improper government action. As an individual, I want to do these things. Should government have any say on that or not? And this gets to the underlying argument of the difference between libertarianism and socialism, liberalism and conservatism, is what is the proper role in government when you have a focus on individualism. That debate is the debate on how much liberty an individual has and how much authority government has, right? Because those two go together. The more liberty an individual has protected for them, the less authority and regulatory power government has. The more you expand the reach of government into regulation, the more you encroach upon the liberty that an individual has to make their own decisions. So those two, right, are two ends of the spectrum there. And your results on the political compass, in one sense, are going to be based quite a bit on how much emphasis you put on liberty of the individual, or the communitarian aspect, right, the community aspect of government bringing us all together and moving in one direction. And some of us won't be happy about that, right? But anytime the government makes a rule for everybody, right, that's always going to be the case. Some are going to think government's doing exactly the right thing and y'all should get on board. Why don't you see this? And others are like, you're making me do things I think are absolutely wrong and don't want to do, and why are you trying to make me do this, right? So that's the ongoing debate and interaction that we have because of this, trying to find this balance between what community needs and what the individual wants and needs. So when you have this idea that the individual is important and that there are proper roles for government, but there are also very much a proper space for the individual, you're trying to find that place, right, where there's a happy balance between the two. And the idea of contracts or agreements helps us, right, step into an arena where we can say, okay, we can figure this out, and we can write up a plan of how this is going to work so that we have some of each, right? And we can try to do the best of both. And that idea that people will come together and put basically a contract out there that determines what's the proper role of government in a society and how do we keep it from being too intrusive on the individual, that's a belief we call constitutionalism. That we can put some kind of written document, constitution, out there that determines how we build government, how we assign power to government, what the proper role of government is, and how we can control that government to keep it in those boundaries that we all agreed to at the beginning, right? And we all as a group have to kind of agree this is the plan we're going to use to do this. And if you don't think you can control government, right, through a constitution, then you don't have this belief that constitutionalism will work or is important. I would submit that, Texas has had 6 of these or so constitutions. The U.S. has had a couple. All of the states have one. A lot of other countries have one. So I think it's a pretty common idea that we believe that laying out these boundaries and these rules and these expectations in a document can help guide us and be fairly useful. Certainly not foolproof, but right, and they're not meant to be foolproof, right? They can't be exhaustive of all the possibilities of what's going to happen with the government and how it works in society. But it, in broad strokes, hopefully it gives us perspective and guidance into, is this possibly a proper place for government to act or not? And if we're watching a government work or participating in a government working, and we keep handy a version, our Constitution, that we can look at that version of rules and say, here's what we said, here's what we expect. Are we as a government doing this, right? Or are we beyond that? Then that's constitutionalism working itself out. And when you watch the legislature do its work here in Texas, you will see this is always a primary focus at the beginning of a bill is this something that's even legally or constitutionally feasible? Is this something government should even be looking at? And so that's an important filter to know that we're using that and should be using that. Once we accept it, right, that we can come up with this kind of written contractual obligatory document that says here are things going to work, then we can build on it, right? Then we can say, okay, here's what we said government's going to do, and here's the legislature doing those things that it's supposed to do. And so if that's true, if they're doing what they're supposed to do, then that's a constitutionally blessed kind of action. And if they're not, then we're having to ask, are you going outside the bounds here, right? Are you following the rules that we put in place, the Constitution we put in place that we agreed upon? And so you hope that they're always looking back at that. And if they're not, ideally, right, we can, through elections, alter the folks that are working in the legislature and tell them, look, you new people need to follow the Constitution, right? Or we'll vote you out too. And that's how we hopefully will keep some kind of congruence between what the people in government are doing, the Constitution that we've agreed to as citizens, and how we move forward with that. It's a challenge, right? It's a constant challenge. And then finally, and the least well-defined topic that Texans think is important is equality. Not that it's the least important, it's very important in Texas, and we talk about it quite a bit, but that we're very much spread out over what we mean by equality being important in Texas and being important to us as citizens and as a role for government. We generally make the argument politically that people are inherently equal. And what we mean by that has to be a definition that we are equal politically, that we have, right, through our Constitution and through our practice, set up a way that we're trying to make sure that all citizens have the same power politically in the system. Because, right, we know for a fact that people are inherently unequal to each other, right? If you've ever been an athlete, one of the first things you learn is there are a lot of people out there that are more athletically gifted than you are, maybe, right? You're not equal on those issues. You may not be equal on conceptual issues. You may not be equal on artistic issues, right? So there are a lot of places people are unequal, right? We're not the same. We're all unique individuals. But the idea of equality here, right, is at a base that we are equal before the law. That's the base. It is not necessarily what we all want, believe, or think is the proper role of government. Isaac, you're pointing out equal opportunity, not equal outcome. And that might be where you are, but it's certainly not where all people are. And that's why we have debates, right? So we can mean a lot of different things when we're using the word equality in a political arena. We can mean political equality, which means, right, we have the same political footing to get involved in government and try to vote what we want in. We could mean that there are the same economic opportunities provided to everybody in our state. We could be meaning that there are the same educational opportunities. We could be meaning that there are the same educational results. We could mean that there are the same economic results, right? Those would be outcome based. And all of those are different arguments about equality. So we think it means at least the minimum to be a political equality. We have the same standing as citizens to be involved, although that's certainly not historically been true, right? We've been fighting for that and moving toward that over time. And as we've recognized more people and extended political opportunity and equality to them, they've been able to get involved in the political game. But we still have challenges even there, right? And how we put in new voting laws and new voting practices, and how we, right, parse out our limited resources to ensure voting outcomes or voting possibilities are the same. So this one here, right, it's included here because Texans talk about equality a lot. We talk about it being important, but we don't mean the same thing when we talk about it, right? And so when you get into an equality discussion, you need to sit down and figure out what equality all of those of you in the discussion mean, or you're going to end up going different directions. So, you know, and while a lot of people, like Isaac has put out here, want to say, well, it only means equal opportunity, that's a very sparse meaning, because we can't even ensure that if we don't look sometimes at equal outcomes. So I'll give you an example. Texas has struggled with education forever, right? Texas Constitution says that we will provide education for all of our residents. The idea that we should treat all of our people the same when we're delivering something through government means that we ought to make sure that, right, it's fairly equal. But we can't even decide on what that means. Does it mean that we've provided a school system that has grades 1 through 12, and there you go. There's your equal opportunity. Does it mean that we provide that and that we spend the same amount of money on every educational district? Okay, there you go. Here's your money. Every school district got the same. Does it mean that we, right, spent the same amount of dollars on every student in every school district? Doesn't mean that if we're spending the same amounts of money that we're going to deliver the same programs. Are we going to let school districts decide, right, which programs are more important, how much they take that money and spend on athletics versus arts versus music versus STEM classes? Or is that going to be something that the government's going to, right, try to regulate and organize? Well, that's a good question. If you leave it up to local governments, what insurance do you have that a student coming out of one school district has gotten the same basic education as one out of another district? And does the government have a role to establish some kind of minimum basic that all students should have? I can't tell you the right answer to that, right? That's the debate that we have.
Can you hear me?
I can barely hear that you're saying something.
Can you hear me right now?
A little better, yes.
Okay. Basically, I just was thinking about it from this point of like, growing up where I grew up in California is definitely, I mean, we learned a lot of different stuff here, and I'm sure just in how am I going to say this? Sorry. Back up a little bit. The local governments are, in my town in California, were definitely they were teaching different things than, say, the local public schools in San Francisco County. And that's because my county was a red county as opposed to the blue county of San Francisco where I grew up, or where other people may have grown up. So what I was saying is that I guess the freedom to be able to teach and also teach what they want, allocate different resources where they want them to be allocated. That has to do with just the freedoms of local city and district governments, right?
I would say probably
like the school board, all the way down to
there's probably a lot more there than you're aware of that comes from the state of California. There's also,
well, I mean, I was even saying it from like even relating it to Texas as well, just like from different like small counties of, this small county. There's Travis County may have a different public resources than. I don't know,
yeah, and so that's the problem, right? Okay, so first, just to clarify on Texas, we don't do it by county even. In Texas, we have a special government called an independent school district, right? Which is a government that we elect school board members to.
Yeah, so that's actually what the last part of what I was saying was that it goes even down all the way to like the school board.
Right, but the school board, so the county doesn't have much to say about educational.
Okay.
Right, it's the school board, but the school board
those elected officials
also is, right, beholden to the state government and only exists because the state government lets it. And so we have a state agency, right, the education, Texas State Education Board of Education, which has elected members from across the state. And they set standards that the school boards have to follow.
Yeah.
So you've got local governments doing some of it. You got state governments doing some of it. You'll have legislation passed by the state legislature that will impact that. And then we're dependent upon federal monies to help fund a good chunk of this. And those come with regulations and requirements as well to get that money.
Okay. Yeah, I was just asking that because I was asking that my dad, when I was growing up, he was one of the school board members in our district growing up. So I was curious if it had anything to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, it does. There's no doubt that the people you elect to your school board are going to play a very important part in driving what happens in that school district.
Mhm.
But then there are all these other pressures and rules and stuff as well. And so it's a very complex thing. And in Texas, we've struggled with it time and time again because we tax people on their property. Since we don't have an income tax, we tax them on their property, and a good chunk of that property income tax then gets translated over into education monies. And so,
Okay.
right, if you're in a high, you own a piece of property with a high value, you're going to pay a lot more taxes that go to schools than someone that's right has a lower
Right.
piece of property. And if you
And
live
how,
in a
I'm just
district,
sorry,
yeah,
how is the education in Texas? Like, just, I know, like, if you think, I know just based on random numbers, I saw like Wyoming recently was like 48th and out of 50 or something like that. Is Texas a high up? Like, what is the education system like here?
I
Is the public
don't
system?
know the last ranking of Texas nationally, but we're usually in the 28 to 36 range, if I'm remembering
Okay.
correct. So we're not horrible, but we're not in the
But
top
I'm not,
half.
Samantha, I'm not trying to compare to California. I'm just saying I'm asking a question.
Well, and the other thing too is you gotta remember that where you're ranked depends upon the measuring stick that you're using, right? So are we measuring based on the number of people, the number of students we had that graduated versus didn't graduate? Are we basing it on the number that passed some kind of federal test or a state test? Are we passing it? I mean, so we don't, you got to figure out how people, what the agenda is of the people that are measuring too, right?
Okay.
So are we going to look at it on how is Texas doing on SAT, ACT scores versus other states?
True.
So
Okay. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
even
Right.
that, yeah, it's interesting, right? It's a great policy area to spend time and you figure out that it's very complicated and a lot of different people come at this with the idea that school education is good and we want to do what we can to ensure that our students come out well educated, but what we think is well educated is also a place that we're going to right have some debates and how we figure out what equality we're going to apply is going to help determine the ends of that debate. So the point of this is that Texans think equality is important, but we have different ideas about what we mean by that. And so you have to always, right? I give you three equalities here, but they may not be the only ones. All right, so those ideas, right, come together and help form our version in Texas of what democracy means and how we're going to try to achieve it. And how governing in Texas is going to look. And it's going to look different, right? Every state, it looks a little different because we all have a different mix of these ideas. So democracy in Texas is right a result or a sum of these things coming together. So what have we talked about over the last few lectures, right? When we talk about democracy, we talked a lot of different things. We talked about the three assumptions, right? That we're going to make decisions based on minority rule while we try to preserve the minorities' rights to keep being involved in that while ensuring that all people are represented in that decision-making process. We're going to evaluate that democracy on whether it preserves political equality, it makes decisions in a non-tyrannical manner, that people get equal participation and an opportunity to deliver it. All of this has to come together for us to have a democracy. And all of that is informed by beliefs that we as individuals carry with us, historical beliefs about what we are as humans and what our goals are as individuals and what the role of government is. So I want to expose you to two political philosophers. If you haven't seen these guys before. Thomas Hobbs is the first one we'll talk about, born in 1588, if I remember correctly. My picture is in the way there. It was behind it before, but it's in front now. So we're going to talk about English philosopher, natural rights philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and then we'll talk about another English natural rights philosopher named John Locke. These two theorists, educators, thinkers, writers laid down a lot of the basic ideas about government and its purpose that our founding fathers in the United States and then later in Texas brought with them when they started carving out expectations of government and constitutions and that. And a lot of these things we don't even think about, right? We just assume they're true, but you have to kind of spend some time with these guys to see where they got these ideas from. And the big deal with Thomas Hobbes is Thomas Hobbes was, right, an educator to English nobility. He was hired privately, right, as a tutor to come teach the children of nobles in England. So it was his job to make sure that they were well educated, they were exposed to a lot of ideas, and at that time that meant philosophy and political thought, and so he was doing that. And he started writing, he wrote several political tracts, but he wrote this one book called The Leviathan. And the point of the Leviathan was to figure out how we have government as opposed to no government. Because you look around the world, and even though you see lots of governments and some are good and some are failing, there always seems to be a development of government. And that was his expression at that time as well. He was looking around and he's looking at the English government going, we're particularly successful. I mean, he was an Englishman, he was proud of it, and it was obviously the best form of government that was happening at the time. That he was living under this monarchy, and England was, right, historically on the rise, and economically, militarily, right, all of that. And so it must have been something good. But he was trying to figure out in his mind, where is it that this came from? Now, if you were to listen to the monarch, he would tell you exactly where it came from, right? Monarchs were pushing this idea called the divine right of kings. In other words, I'm your king because God said I'm your king, and therefore you should do everything that I say, or you're going against, right, God. I'm their surrogate here on earth, and I'm in charge, so do what I'm telling you to do. Which meant that any move to change government was, in a sense, an act of insolence against religion and God, and you're a heretic for doing it. Hobbes wasn't so much into that, and thought that, well, that's a very convenient argument to a monarch to make, and if I were one, I'd make the same argument, but it doesn't really make sense. So what would be rational and logical to explain why we have governments, and not all of them are monarchies, right? If the divine right of kings argument was true, all governments would be monarchies, and they weren't. And of course, they're not today. So what is it that underlies the development of a government? And so he tries to go back to the beginning. And what he says is, it's unimpeachable, at least into his mind, that individuals have these notions and drives and expectations that are inherent to them, that belong to every person. If you look at man, right, he was using this as a generic term. If you look at man has, right, a right to self-determination, a drive to self-determination, and a drive to self-protection. And those seem to exist in every person. So let's assume those are just natural states of being, right? Those are natural rights. They're inherent in each individual. They come before anything else. And so we think we can posit that. And if we can, then we can start thinking, well, how is it that all of these unique individuals with these the right to protect themselves and the right to control their own life, how is it that we move from that to a society? What's the step there? So he argues that before society, there had to be something else, and he calls it the state of nature. And I'll show you on the next slide a description of the state of nature, but it's basically the wilderness, right? It's not society, and it's not a good place to be. And humans, being rational at their core, would like to be at a better place than the state of nature, where it's basically dog eat dog, right? It's the strongest over the weakest. It's might makes right. That's not a place most of us want to be. So we want to escape that. And he thinks that as rational beings, we will do something to create a better situation. He thinks and posits that we will, come to an agreement one among another, saying, look, we could fight over these resources, right? And one of us would win and one of us would lose, and the one that would lose might be dead and would certainly be hurt, but even the winner might be hurt. And that makes them vulnerable to the next one coming along that wants the same resource. There's got to be a better way for us to try to figure this out without having to hit each other over the head all the time. And he believes that rational people will agree to something that will help them live without having to resort to violence every time a decision needs to be made. And he calls that something society, right? He believes that rational man will, through a contract, create society. And he thinks that the monarchy he's living under, which he refers to as Leviathan, is the most rational societal development to come out of that kind of contractual situation, that you will look to the person that's the strongest or most able and expect them to be the leader and pick them to be the leader. And then you will find places where you can be successful, and you'll come together as a group, and all of you together will be better off than any of you outside of society. So let's skip on over to the next slide, and I'm going to read this to you, right? This is his description of the state of nature, right? And he's of course trying to make it as ugly as possible, and he does a pretty good job. He says, in the state of nature, men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention furnish them withal. In that condition, in such a condition, there is no place for industry, there's no place for culture, there's no knowledge of the arts, right? There's no knowledge of the earth, there's no time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, there's a continual fear of and danger of violent death. And the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So painting that super ugly picture of life before society and life before governments, he thinks that rational people will try to escape that. Now, when they do that, they're going to bring with them these ideas of natural rights, that all people have a right to personal protection. So when we go into a contractual situation, we're going to try to make sure that we're protected, right? That's inherent. And that we're going to try to get the best contract we can to make sure we have a better experience in this Leviathan than we would have had in the state of nature. But he also thinks that it's going to be normal and rational for us to create a state, to create a government and a society, because that's going to be the tool that allows us to all work together and do better than if we were out in the wilderness as an individual. So this is the argument he's putting together. We have natural rights to self-protection, right, to do well for ourselves. We have this rationality that we can use to think through and solve problems, and we will. And we will construct a social contract. We will build society intentionally. We will propagate it with some form of government. Monarchy works, right? And we will move forward. However, we don't give up all of our rights, our natural rights especially, when we create this new society. We agree not to resort to force and violence to make decisions, right? We've created a society with rules for making decisions. But if the society gets to the point where it's threatening our life, it's threatening our natural right to be able to care for ourselves and be successful, we retain a right to rebel against that society and revert back to the state of nature. Okay, so what he's done is he's created this idea that individuals have rights prior to society, that individuals create society and government, and that individuals have a right to rebel against that government if it goes off the rails. We don't question these big ideas today, right? This is pretty much where we assume all this, right? But Hobbes was working all this up and putting it out there, and he wrote it in the Leviathan. It became a bestseller. The monarchy was not pleased because what he had just said was, in this book, he'd made a rational, compelling argument that the divine right of kings theory was not the case, and that you actually do have a right to rebel against your government when it's treating you the way, badly. And so that did not make the monarchy happy, and they immediately tried to arrest and imprison Hobbes for this seditious writing. He was deemed a traitor to the crown, and he had to leave England and go to France. So, so while we don't necessarily look at political tracts and political treatises as this important today, right? It had a profound impact on what people were thinking and talking about, such that the monarchy heard it, paid attention to it, and responded. Because the last thing they wanted was someone putting out a rational argument to overthrow the king, right? And that's what he had done. That wasn't his intention, but this right to rebel was there. And as you can see, none of this goes away if you start thinking about what we have today, right? Individualism is important. People have the right to make their own decisions, guide their own lives. Government is there to help, right? If it doesn't, you change it, right? So what he's talking about in the 1650s and thereabouts, writing about, is exactly what we have, right, and what we expect today. John Locke, right, comes along after Hobbes. He's very much aware of Hobbes' writing. He has read it. He's essentially an intellectual descendant of Hobbes, and he too thinks that this is making some sense, right? That these natural rights are there, that people do have them. They do help us escape the hypothetical state of nature, and it justifies the society. But he doesn't think that rational people just normally end up with a monarchy. He thinks that's much too constrained, that at the time that he's writing, right, you've had much more upheaval. You've had much more challenge to the nature of monarchs, and it seems that, right, if you're still holding on to the divine right of kings at that point, God's changing his mind about who's in charge all the time. And so he didn't go that direction. He thinks that rational man, when they put this together, is going to try to find the best society they can. And it doesn't necessarily lead to any particular form of government, but whatever government it leads to. When you contract into building this, you give your consent, you stand up and you say, I'm going to be a part of this government. You're going to be looking for three things. You're going to be looking for a government that is limited, right, in its scope to protecting your life, protecting your liberty, which means, again, a space free from government, and protecting the property that you as an individual have, right? So, and what's happened in the meantime between Hobbes and Locke is this notion of property has become a big deal, because we see the economic fortunes of England and as they're traveling around the world, sailing around the world, and trading around the world. And the idea that there's intellectual property and there's real property and there's financial properties, right? All of these ideas are ginning up and being discussed. And Locke says, property is something that's very, very important, and it's something that belongs to the individual. It needs to be protected by government. So Locke steps beyond Hobbes and goes to the point of making government answerable to the people, right? You don't just overthrow government when they come to maybe threaten your life. You've got expectations that the government is going to deliver on things that you put it there to do. And these things, right, are not a whole lot here, but right, very, very important. That whatever the laws are, the government will enforce them properly, and that the property that people develop and have, those rights to property will always be protected by the government, not taken away by the government. And for Locke, this is a really important idea, because this is the idea that, and he's the one that's kind of bringing it together, I think, most coherently at this time, is an argument that who you are as a person, your identity as an individual, is to a large extent defined by your property, right? So we talk about us being in a socioeconomic class, a lower class, a middle class, a high class, right? And this is where this is starting to really be kind of teased out at the time, right? They're starting to talk about the property you have defining you as an individual, defining your opportunities in public, defining your opportunities in government, defining who's going to listen to you or not listen to you. And I have lost my screen. There it is. Okay. Can you all see the slide still? Yeah, it went black on mine for some reason. I got to figure out what's going on here. Let me see if I can just change the slide. There we go. Okay, so changing the slide brings it back. So he's very big on making this argument that because property is so important to the identity of you as a person, this is really the biggest end of government. The biggest focus of government is to preserve property and preserve property rights. And if they can't do that, they can't protect you as an individual and who you are, and that invokes your natural rights to rebel against government. So let's think a little bit about what he's saying here. How many of you think your property is a defining characteristic of who you are as a person? Right? Are you the things that you own? We like to argue, as Samantha has said, yeah, not me, right? I'm more than that. Or are you a cat lady, Samantha? Yeah, but anyway, right? Yeah, right. I mean, you're what you have definitely does play a part in who you are. And I use this example every semester, and I think it translates pretty well. Think about as you're growing up, as you get older, your opportunities to be mobile change, right? First, you're limited to where you can walk, and then you get a bicycle, and then maybe a car, right? And every time that your opportunities of mobility expand, so does your freedom. So does, right, your definition of who you are, right, and what you're capable of doing. So the property that you have can certainly impact your identity as a person. How you dress, choices that you make to generate some kind of perspective of you, what you own, how you communicate, right? All of those things, right, are tied to property and expressions of you as an individual. And that's what Locke is telling us, right? That the choices we make about this and how we extend ourselves into society reveal a lot about us as a person. So that's an interesting point there, Riley, that the older generation seems to do it based on things like your house, your car, your job. And right now, I would probably assert that that's not on the forefront of most of you if you're of typical college age, right? You're not looking that far down the road about your house. You're trying to learn, you're trying to figure out what you're going to do, you're trying to find out what interests you. Once you make those choices, though, I'm going to be this, I'm going to do this, you're starting to develop an identity of yourself. And how successful you are in those choices that you choose yourself are going to be reflected outwardly. And this is what Locke would argue, right? By the things that you choose to invest in, whether that's a house or whether you're renting, whether that's a car or whether you're using public transportation or some other transportation, right? Whether you have the absolute latest, glitziest communication device, or whether maybe, yes, right? Do you know from that delineation between iPhone people and Android people, do you learn something about them by that? If you do, and that stereotype has some truth to it, and most stereotypes do, then your property is maybe, right, an expression of who you are. Now, consider for a moment that you've decided, right, who you are, what you're doing, and where you're going to put your interest, your time, and your effort. And then the government makes a decision that's contrary to that and says you can't. That's what he's talking about. At the time he's writing, right, that's going to be a decision based strictly on like real property or money or something. He's going to make the argument, Locke is going to make the argument that if the government attacks your property, if the government attacks this extension of your choices and your belief and your life plans, then it's in effect attacking you as an individual. And it's attacking and violating your consent, right, that you join this government, this society under, and you have a right to revolt. Now, revolt doesn't always necessarily mean a violent overthrow. What Locke talks about quite often is if society as a whole moves one direction, and that's different than what you consented to when you joined it, you have the right to extract yourself out of it and go somewhere else and live a different way. Now, what that means practically is you're going to have to sell your house and sell your property, sell your business, and go someplace else and start over, right? That has a different set of rules that still work for you. But he says that's your right. Your right is you give consent, you join a society, you accept its rules for what they are. And if things go different than you expect or you want, then you have the right to opt out and go somewhere else. Or if it's a much more physical attack, you still do have the ability to violently revolt too. He doesn't say that you can't do that either, right? So, we do this. We've embodied this idea, right? I did my advanced studies education at Texas A&M, and while I was there, I heard this phrase all the time that kind of brought this home to me. And some of you, if you are Aggies or been around Aggies, you may have heard them say something along the lines of when there's a disagreement going on, an Aggie, especially in Aggie land, will say something like, "Look, Highway 6 runs both ways." And what they mean by that is that here we're doing it this way. And if you don't like that, there's the highway. It goes two different directions. You don't have to stay, right? You don't, America, love it or leave it, right? Those kind of platitudes, those kind of arguments and ideas come from this idea here, right? They come from this kind of perspective that There are other things going on in the world that are different than this society and different than this government, and you choose to be here. And as long as it's successful for you, great. But if it's not, or you don't like where it's going, go choose somewhere else, right? That's the argument coming out of this. And we still say those things today, right? I mean, and it's just a recognition that Locke was making at the same time that government has impact on people's lives and their property and who they are. And sometimes people have to choose whether they stay with it, move on, or try to change it internally or revolt, right? And that's where this idea of rebellion comes out of this focus on the individual and natural rights that are imbued to the individual, and that government is something that's supposed to help us and that we have some authority over, right? It extracts us out of the divine right of kings argument. And of course, here in the States, we took a lot of this and ran with it, right? We took these ideas of these natural rights philosophers. We took these ideas of the individual having something in them that was prior to state and government. We took this idea that people used their power and rights to create a government to work for them, and that they have a right to change it and to be a part of it and to overthrow it if necessary, right? Does that make sense? Right, I'm not telling you have to buy into this and this is absolutely true or anything like that. What I'm telling you is this is the kind of theoretical thought and idea of philosophy that informed how it is we came to have these perspectives about individualism and about liberty and about constitutionalism, right, and democracy. That's equality. That's where these ideas are really getting worked up. Okay, so we're not going to get through all the rest of these today, but we're gonna dive into them. The rest of this slide deck, and we're only going to talk about it for the rest of the day, but spend some time with it. The rest of this slide deck is what I call my isms lecture. And so I give you what I think are very much generally accepted definitions of these isms: socialism, liberalism, libertarianism, right? Fascism, anarchism, all the isms, or at least a good number of the isms. And so I start off with socialism as our first one, right? And the reason I do this is because this is the one that prompted me to write this. I kept hearing people talk about that the U.S. is becoming is subject to socialism, right? And that's a horrible, bad thing. And our government is socialist in its design. And while there are certainly issues with how our government does things that a lot of us will take, we need to understand when we use the word socialism that it has a historical context. And this is, I think, a pretty middle of the road definition of what socialism means. So let's look at it, right? Socialism is the working class, not necessarily the middle class, not the upper class, the working class, right? Blue collar, effectively controlling the means of production, right? Effectively controlling the means of their livelihood. In other words, the workers have control over their workplaces. That's socialism, right? They have that control because they build what are called cooperative enterprises. That's a publicly owned exercise or industry. It could use the state, right, government, as a way to manage some of this, but it doesn't require, right, a state, right, to be organizing the socialism. It can be done privately. Socialism in and of itself does not have to be tied to the government. We have in the United States many examples of companies that are owned by their employers. They're owned by the people that work there. The board is populated of employees. and they make their own management decisions. They make their own product development decisions. They make their own sales decisions. They decide how they're going to get reimbursed. This is not right. It's all privately organized, right? This is people coming together to do this. So you can have socialism and still have government that's separate from it doing different things. Now you can also have, right, government controlling means of production, government controlling means of livelihood, and then it would be a government form of socialism. But you need to understand that they're not always together, and socialism doesn't mean the government is running all these things. Just to drive that home a little deeper, if any of you have grown up in agriculture areas and you've worked farms or ranches, you've probably, right, gone to the county co-op. And if you know what a co-op is, you've been a part of a socialist experiment, right? It is a very common practice that farmers especially will form a buying organization that they call the cooperative. And that cooperative's job is to go buy seed and buy fertilizer and buy farm equipment and buy it in bulk so that they get a good price on it, bring it back to the area that put the co-op together, and then sell it, right, for cost or for cost plus a little to keep the co-op going, right? But saving money for all of the people, right, that did this. That's a form of socialism, and some of our most ardent individualist and governmentally libertarian folks use this tool, farmers, to save themselves money and to become more profitable in their business. Okay, Gregory, I was in the Army for 10 years, and that's all the socialism I needed, right? Experiences will last a lifetime. There's no doubt about it. So, yeah, whether you like this socialism or don't like this socialism, what I'm trying to get people to understand is that it is a way about making decisions and running things, and it doesn't require a state government or a national government to do it. People can do it on their own, and it is a form of individuals coming together in a group and making decisions for themselves as a group. And we do that all over the place, right? So there's a couple examples of it. So when someone is railing about this is socialism and that's contrary to capitalism, not necessarily, right? A board of directors is a very small group of people effectively controlling their business and making decisions about the means of production. And it might very well be a socialist type of organization for them at the top, right? Okay, so let's go the other direction. This is a word we're hearing a lot in the last 4 years, right? Is the word fascism. I can understand how this word gets used in the same way I can understand how the word socialism gets used. But when you look at the actual word fascism, and not just look at the two main examples of what were fascist countries, fascism is really a form of organization around corporatist principles. This is really confusing, but I'm going to say it anyway. When you look at Germany and you look at Italy, which are two of our biggest fascist examples when we bring them out, what you're pointing at are examples of authoritarianism and nationalism, right? And those two ideas come together to lead a country, right, wherever it leads it. Spain under Franco had fascism as well. It's a big stretch to say that what we see in the U.S. is fascism in the vein of, 1930s and 40s Germany and 40s Italy, late 30s and 40s Italy, right? That's not the kind of fascism people are talking about today. We're talking about the authoritarianism that comes along with fascism, right? A leader, a cult of personality, and people identifying with that as the national leadership. That's kind of what we say when we say fascism. But the real idea here is that we've organized our nation around the values and systems and beliefs and goals of corporatist perspectives. And so if you think that our country and our government is run based upon corporatist perspectives and values, that when Exxon says jump, the government says how high, or Google or Apple or whatever, that's more fascism in a correct vein than anything else. Yeah, Samantha, what you're tapping into is the authoritarianism, right? Military life has strict authoritarianism, right? There's a strict chain of command, and there's a military code that goes along with operating in that command. Yes, absolutely. And most of us, I think, say fascism when we mean authoritarianism, right? We mean those rules that dictate every part, trying to dictate every part of our life. When it's much more tied to national and state politics, looking at running the government and the country to the benefit of the corporations that are in it, right? So again, right, we use these terms a little different than they probably what they probably mean, and we need to understand where we're going off and that we're meaning different things. So an oligarchy or oligarchism is when you have a power structure where a very small group of society, usually identifiable by some characteristic, is the ruling group of society because of that characteristic, right? So in a monarchy, it's going to be the royalty. In a fascist system, it might be the corporatist leaders, the wealthy. In a country that has experienced a coup or a junta, right, it would be military control. In a place where it's a set of ruling families that are always competing, right, and multiple generations of that family come to power and are competing with other generations, Bushes and Clintons and maybe Trumps and Kennedys and things like that. It might be oligarchy through family organizations. What I'm hoping you're seeing here is that we're a weird mishmash of a lot of these ideas, right? We see some truth in oligarchy, and we see some truth of our society in fascism, and see some truth in our society in socialism, and there's a lot going on here, right? Most of the time in the U.S., we define ourselves politically into two groups, conservatives and liberals. Third group making a jump into this is libertarians, right? So conservatives are, if you think of conservatives as people wanting to conserve, in other words, keep what the status quo is, don't change, keep what's working. If you do change slowly, then you'll be close, right? And that's why as people tend to get older, they tend to become more conservative because they know what worked for them and they don't want society going away from that because, hey, it worked for them, right? Let's don't change all this. And a lot of times conservatives are going to say things like, let's look to the past for what worked and keep doing that, like make America great again, right? That's a conservative mantra, right? Look to those things that have been successful in the past. Let's stay with them. That's conservatism. You drag conservatives into the future, right? They don't go there willingly, right? Because they're focused on if it's not broke, don't fix it. right? And so notice that conservatism is not telling you whether you ought to be authoritarian or fascist or democratic or socialist. This is a perspective that it then informs, right, the kind of government that you're working with. On the other side of it is its competitors' liberalism. Liberals focus on big ideas and expect society to keep trying to reach those ideals, like equal rights and individual liberty. But look at some of these ideas and tell me that these aren't ideas that conservatives don't hold as well. Ideas that constitutions are important and we ought to pay attention to them. Ideas that there ought to be a democracy that is liberal in the sense that it lets individuals participate, that we ought to have free and fair elections. There ought to be basic human rights. Capitalism is the mode of economics that we want to use because, right, it lets the individual, right, go its own way. Free trade, a separation of church and state. These are the ideas that our founding fathers brought to the United States from studying Hobbs, Locke, Rousseau, Paine, right, and put into our first set of Bill of Rights and put into our Constitution. And our Texans took those ideas and ran with them as well. All of us in the United States are liberal by this definition. And liberals today have moved beyond this, but I want all of you conservatives and all of you libertarians and all of you that are today liberals to understand that this is the root of our democratic principles. Constitutions, democracy, free and fair elections, human rights, capitalism. This is what it means in the real definitional sense to be a liberal. So you conservatives, you're liberal conservatives. You libertarians, you're, and this is confusing, liberal libertarians. And you liberals, you're liberal liberals, right? If you're a populist, you're a liberal populist, right? Because this is the underlying root of who we are. This is the base of our experience under democracy. I know I'm over time. If you want to hang around, I will finish the next two slides with you. If you want to go and you want to read these slides on your own, please do not feel like you have to stay, right? I am going to keep talking, and I will save the recording, and you can come back to it if you want to. If you got another class, you got another obligation, you're tired of hearing me talk, have a good day and a good weekend. So libertarians, right, are folks that have, especially in the United States, the liberals that focus on the individual, focus on liberty for that individual, for all individuals. And they elevate these ideas, right? And believe that government is, libertarians generally are going to say government is necessary, but we want the absolute minimum amount of it that we can get, because all government represents some kind of coercion over individuals. Maybe not me, but maybe another individual, right? Anytime a government makes a law, makes a rule, it's putting coercion out into the system and it's making some people go along with it. So libertarians are going to be saying, look, we want to have the biggest scope of freedom for individuals that we can, and the least amount of government that we can, so people have that liberty. And we want most organizations to be organizations of voluntary nature, right? If something can be done in private, let private handle it, the private industry handle it. And if they choose not to, well, then maybe it's not that important. Government doesn't have to come up and try to solve every problem in society. Government is here to do a few minimal things: protect me, protect my property, right? And that might be it, right? And then the rest of it is try to let me make my own way. And there's a real seductive quality to this for the individual, right? That we in Texas, of course, right, try to prop up and think is important. So we shouldn't be surprised that there are a good number of libertarians in Texas, because we've put an emphasis on individualism and liberty, right, as what it means to be Texan. So when you're at the voting booth, you will notice, looking down at your ballot, that there are usually libertarian candidates right there competing with the Democrats and the Republicans. So there's a lot of that going on here. The hard part about libertarianism is that they're so much focused on individualism that it's hard for them to come together and get anything done as a group. And some libertarians will tell us that's a blessing, but it also means that if you're going to address some, like education, that you're going to have a lot of different perspectives about what it ought to be and how we ought to work toward it, and should the government be involved. So in a real sense, the emphasis on individualism with libertarianism is its biggest strength and its biggest weakness, right? Because if you're trying to get a group to do something, they've got to agree, and they got to agree to those to come together and work together, and that's tough. Okay. Last is anarchy or anarchism. These are, a lot of libertarians will tell you that they're anarchist. And I think when they say that, they only mean it as an intellectual definition, right? A lot of libertarians would love for it to be the case that we didn't need a state. And if we could ever get to a condition where there was no government, then they would be an anarchist. Because that's the focus of anarchy, the absolute abolition or absence of a government. The argument is completely contrary to your Hobbes and Lockean perspective, right? Because anarchists are telling us human nature is such that we can get along in the state of nature, right? We can form agreements that are based upon a rational, anarchists would say no because it's ugly, right? The Walking Dead's ugly and it doesn't work, right? And the argument underlying The Walking Dead is that we need community to be successful, right? And zombies actually would be, from that argument, the expression of anarchy. The zombies are anarchy, right? The group that's trying to survive, not so much anarchy, right? Because they're trying to come together and find something that works, that protects them. And they're going to regulate each other's behavior, right? You've got to do things to be safe. You got to do things to look after the group as a whole. Anarchist, that's a problem, right? Because they really want this to be kind of the happy place that everybody ends up, right? And you don't have regulations or authority being exercised over you. And Hobbes and Locke would look at this and go, yeah, that's not human nature. That ain't gonna happen. So we have a historical, functional chaos. That's good. We have historical experiments in the U.S. with intentional communities that are non-governmental. We call them communes. And they've never been that successful for a long period of time. And notice that they're only happening within the protection of another government, right? Communes are interesting, but they don't work for a long time, right, usually. All right, let's call it a day. Any questions? Be happy to hang around and answer some if you got them. All right, y'all have a good day, have a good weekend, and we'll see y'all next week.